take it from there. So, Senator Rennick.
Yeah, hi guys, how you going? I've got a letter from the Chief Health Officer of the WA Health Service Providers sent to health workers on the 14th of October saying that adverse events haven't been reported via the appropriate channels and that they have a statutory responsibility to report adverse events within 72 hours. Why are health workers being reminded of this so far into the rollout? And given this under-reporting, do you have confidence that all adverse events are being reported to TGA, especially in light of the fact that you're reviewing this on a rolling basis for longitudinal purposes as well?
Thank you, Senator. And really it's the responsibility of the local government. So I imagine that the West Australian Health Minister and Chief Health Officer will be having some fairly stern discussions if there's credible evidence that, say, a hospital, private or public, or other service within Western Australia has not reported adverse events. I would add that we have had superb cooperation from the states and territories, and there are occasionally allegations or assertions of this. More commonly, the assertions come from individual patients, and for example, I don't want to comment on a particular case for patient confidentiality, but so, for example, in recent weeks there's been a case in the media where someone has said, well, I've had this adverse event following a vaccine, but TGA is not doing anything about it. That was actually reviewed by committee and by the Chief Health Officer of a particular state, I'm being vague deliberately, who concluded that it was not at all related to a vaccine. So in that case, the health system doesn't have to report. Some have a system whereby if it's a death within any period of time, but this was not a death, they do. So this is really an issue for the states and territories. We will never get every adverse event reported. Our role is to actually get a sense of whether, and for example, this contributed to Australia's early response to TTS. So our death rate due to that rare complication of AstraZeneca was so much lower than other countries such as the UK.
Yep, sure.
So it's really to get that bigger picture.
Okay, thank you. So just to follow up on that, I've spoken with a 37-year-old woman who suffered complications about 15 minutes after getting her first Pfizer shot. She's ended up having a stroke and has been in and out of hospital for the last 2 months. She's just had her 18th IV drip in the last 3.5 days. She was categorised as a B1 status, which means that authorities won't say whether or not it was caused by the vaccine. Given that she had the reaction within 15 minutes after the vaccine, I'm kind of surprised, I'm curious to know as to what you have to do to be categorised as having a vaccine injury if in a reaction 15 minutes after taking the vaccine.
So apart from anaphylaxis, which is an allergic type response, it does have circulatory components, a stroke, a myocardial infarction, a clot is almost unheard of 15 minutes post-vaccination. The human body just doesn't work that quickly. And so, again, I don't want to delve into that individual's case for confidentiality reasons. I'm aware of what you're talking about. But again, when the panels of experts within the states look at this, one of the key things is a temporal relationship. And if a biological process takes a day to form, but clots do not form in seconds. If a process takes days to form, it's generally felt that other things. Now, sadly, even young people, even in their 20s, 30s and 40s, do have strokes. Lower than in the older, but they do have strokes. Okay,
thank you. So with that in mind, given that people who, have COVID up to 28 days, I'll stand to be corrected if that's right, but, they can be counted as dying with COVID. Why is it so hard? Why is the onus of proof seems to be on the other way, whereby if someone has a clot, someone who's young and healthy, and I know of quite a few, why is the onus of proof on to prove that it wasn't the vaccine, given that with COVID counting it's the other way around?
Well, when it comes to adverse events, the most responsible thing you can do is to see whether certain things are causally related to a vaccination or a medicine for that matter, or are likely to be coincidental. So if you counted every adverse event that happened within 2 weeks of having a vaccine or a medicine, basically you would be incorrectly counting 99%. Because in Australia, 160,000 people, for example, die every year. If you run the stats, that means that within a month of having a COVID vaccine, assuming we're now up in the 70s, 80s and 90s, If you do your maths quickly in your head, you'll have 10,000 people a month dying within a period of having a COVID vaccine.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
So it actually would make the figures worse than meaningless.
I accept that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd come back at you and say
Yeah.
17,000 people died from respiratory disease in 2019 as well, and we didn't shut the country down for that. But we'll leave that. So do you think, I've got a number of people who've had adverse events after taking vaccine for their first shot. They don't want to take their second shot and they can't get an exemption. Do you think that it's right that these people are being forced against their own will to take a second shot, get a second shot when they've had a severe adverse reaction to the first shot?
Well, we've talked before about the differing roles of the Commonwealth and the states and territories in mandating vaccinations. There is, and ATAGI has produced advice on if, for example, people have an anaphylactic reaction to Pfizer in their first shot, they are encouraged not to take Pfizer as a second shot and be given a second shot. So we have several different vaccines now available to individuals. And so the advice is that if you have had a reaction and your doctors have a view that it's related to a vaccine, there are alternatives for them to have a different vaccine as their second shot based on medical advice.
Right, okay, but, so what are your options? You've got two mRNA ones, Moderna and Pfizer.
And you have one
You've got
totally different
which is an adenovirus.
AstraZeneca vaccine.
Well, we don't have, so I guess that's the next question is when is the Novavax coming? Because many
So
people are interested in that
Novavax, they've pushed, we still do not have a full Novavax application. In fact, I'm meeting with Novavax if I get out of here at 3 o'clock this afternoon.
one. Yeah, sure.
And they have announced in the global press that in the next fortnight they'll be finalising their submissions. So no regulator globally has approved Novavax.
Yep.
They'll be finalising their submissions to major regulators, and we assume that includes us.
Okay, thanks. And also just...
But that's when we'll receive a submission. That's the beginning of the process.
Yeah. And then with COVAX, I think that's made by an Australian company called Vaccine with an X.
Yes.
How far away is that up for?
My senior colleagues met with that company yesterday. We don't yet have an indication from them on when they will submit, but again, they are welcome to submit with the available evidence, as is any company, Australian or internationally.
Okay, thanks. Now, look, I know we talked about this earlier. In the immunisation handbook, it says that people can't be coerced or manipulated into taking the vaccine. Why are employers and premiers threatening up to $20,000 fines for people who don't get vaccinated, for example, in Western Australia, or people are going to be locked out of retail, from going shopping or, crossing state borders? Surely, given Section 109 of the Constitution that says federal laws always override state laws, if federal laws mandate that vaccines can't be voluntary, why are we allowing state premiers and employers to force people to take a vaccine when they can't be coerced? And the other part in the immunisation handbook says that, all the risks and benefits need to be weighed up. And given that we still haven't completed longitudinal studies on the vaccine and we don't know how many booster shots we need, don't you think people still should have the choice as to whether or not they have to take the vaccine without punishment?
Professor Kelly might address that.
Yeah, so I might start. Thank you for your question, Senator. So I think the Minister has already answered that from the Commonwealth perspective, we are not mandating vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccine, and that was a very deliberate choice made right from the beginning of the very first announcements. What has happened over time, and this has been a matter of quite a lot of discussion amongst the Chief Health Officers in the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee that I chair, about the risks and benefits of various approaches. Where we have ended up, and AHPPC have given advice to National Cabinet in relation to these matters, it's been published, has been in very specific circumstances where either people are at very high risk, or very high because of their employment, or are extremely vulnerable. That's where we've gone for the mandating, and that's been in relation to aged care.
Just to give you one example, I've been told, and I'll stand be corrected. Sorry to interrupt you there. Fruit pickers have been told they've got to be vaccinated even though they're working outside.
So just to be clear, so that's the only time that the Commonwealth's been involved with those decisions. All other decisions in relation to mandating for various, and there's quite long lists. I agree with you in terms of occupations in certain states have been a matter for the states. They've taken that for their own reasons.
Okay, and I accept that.
I can't
the answer's
answer
political,
why.
I suspect. Sorry, Minister,
Yeah.
but I I'm aware of the Constitution, and 109 says that federal laws override state laws. And I'm also familiar with employment law that says if it's not in the contract, and this was confirmed in a High Court a couple of weeks ago, I fail to see how employers can force people to take a vaccine, and I'll happy to put the aged care and health to one side there. Why isn't the Prime Minister standing up to the employers and state premiers, telling them that they've got to respect individual choice as to what goes into their body?
So the Commonwealth position is that vaccination is voluntary, as Professor Kelly has said. In the case of aged care workforce, where we're dealing with a workforce that's supporting vulnerable people, Age PPC provided some advice to National Cabinet in support of compulsory vaccination for the aged care workforce. That's the one circumstance where that's occurred. In the context of particular employers, the government has stated that where an employer wants to say to its workforce that they need to be vaccinated, there is a process through our industrial relations law that would support that or otherwise, and they should go through that process to resolve that as an issue for them. As Professor Kelly has also indicated, with respect to other elements of the workforce, healthcare workers, for example, at a state level, those mandates are in place by virtue of state law and public health orders that are made under state law. There isn't, though, as such, a law at a federal level, so the context that you bring up of a federal law overriding a state law, there are separations in relative powers.
Can I sorry to interrupt you there?
So we don't have a federal law
So
that
what's the
mandates
immunisation handbook
voluntary.
referring to?
Sorry?
So when the immunisation handbook says you can't be coerced into taking a vaccine, surely that's relying on a law. Why is the federal government holding that position if it's not in the law?
The vaccination handbook is reflecting the Commonwealth's perspective that vaccination is voluntary, but there are other legislative powers at a state level that give them the capacity to put in place public health orders, as we are seeing around the country, that provide mandates.
Okay, thanks, Minister. Look, now just back to our conversation we had a couple of months ago, Professor Skerritt, about ivermectin. You said one of the reasons why you banned GPs from prescribing it was that you weren't confident that 12 milligrams a day was safe. Do you remember that conversation?
I remember it well.
Yep, okay. I've been sent since a Senate report that was given from Merck, the maker of ivermectin, to the TGA back in 2013, that said that tests on 30, 60 and 90 milligrams a day for day 1, day 4 and day 7 were safe, and also dosages up to 120 milligrams were safe. So in the context of prophylaxis or early treatment on healthy people, do you still hold the view that 12 milligrams isn't safe, given that prior data from the maker themselves have indicated much higher dosages are safe?
I think it's important for you to understand, I'm very well aware of my own data, but I think it's important to understand it in context. That was looking at doses 3 days apart, 3 doses only, with healthy volunteers. Now, the doses that have been advocated for ivermectin prophylaxis are 12 milligrams a day, daily for 5 consecutive days. That's a net dose of 60 milligrams. In contrast, for parasites, the dose is 3 to 15 milligrams, either once off or twice off at weekly intervals. So the ivermectin dose at 60 milligrams net over 5 days is 4 to 20 times higher than the dose used for parasites.
How do you come up with 20? I can see.
Well, 3 milligrams, depending on the patient's body weight, because of the toxicity of ivermectin, it's titrated according to the body weight. Some less toxic medicines, everyone gets the same size pill, no matter whether you're a 12-year-old kid or a 200-kilogram adult. Ivermectin is actually done according to body weight, and so that's the range. But it is important to realise that there's a very big difference between what you might give to someone who is already sick versus clinical trials that quite routinely examine healthy, generally young males.
I'm referring to early treatment here. Before it gets into their lungs, they get very sick. Yeah, that's my question. So, interesting enough, you say this is toxic, ivermectin. On the World Health Organisation, it reports 20 reported deaths. in the adverse event section of drugs. These COVID vaccines within a year have already reported over 10,000 reported deaths. I know that doesn't necessarily mean they died from the vaccine, but I'm surprised you'd think it was toxic, given that, you know, it's already on the World Health Organisation of list of essential medicines, which means it's obviously got a high...
At a low and reasonable dose of
Yep.
3 to 5 milligrams
Yep.
once for every 2 weeks, it's fine at that dose.
Yeah, sure.
At higher doses, there have been patients admitted to a number of hospitals. It's now one of the significant... There was a recent paper published from in the west coast of the US, their poison centre, and they're seeing a large number of calls with things like coma, convulsions, fever, fainting, and so forth with ivermectin. So at high doses, ivermectin is toxic.
Okay, thank you. And one more, just one quick one.
quickly.
How many more booster shots do you think we'll need, the population will need, in order to, you know, move on from COVID?
No one has a crystal ball. There are a number of cases of vaccines where after a third shot, your immunity is quite sustained, sustained for many months or years. No one in the world knows whether it will be 3 years' time or never, or whether it's 1 year time or whatever. But what has been encouraging is that even with the standard course of 2 doses, immunity has been maintained for quite a significant period. And so the booster shot is really a case of providing even additional support, especially against infection. The protection after 2 shots against serious illness or hospitalisation is still extremely high.
So we won't necessarily need to mandate third shots, in your view?
Well, I don't think anyone is talking about mandating third shots.
We're not talking about mandating.
I can quote the Minister for Health, because he and I were at a press conference this morning. He was asked, does he believe third shots will be mandated? And he said he doesn't see a reason at this stage. So I'm actually quoting Minister Hunt on that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Senator.